Okay, thank you to all the panelists for your very interesting presentations. We now have just under 20 minutes to take questions from the audience. We will have 2 microphones on, I think, either side of the room. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and you can direct it to any or multiple members of the panel. So we see the gentleman there in the check shirt. And please, if you can, speak directly into the microphone so that we can get it on the recording.
Sure. Hi. I'm Maurice Dier. I'm at UC Davis. I'm part of the Mellon Initiative on Comparative Border Studies. And I thought all of the presentations were really interesting, and I have a question for Professor Jones. Sorry. I thought that was really interesting. I know that you're not a spokesperson for Humane Borders, so maybe you can't really answer it. I work for a group called Watch the Med, and we focus on the Mediterranean Sea and the deaths there, and we try to counter, obviously, the violations that happen there. 2016, more than 5,000 people drowned there. So it's kind of similar in a way, but we explicitly do not use humanitarian narratives to kind of frame our interventions, because we feel that ultimately they're a bit limiting, right? They're a bit depoliticizing in a sense. And they're not really going to the core of the problem, and they're not offering maybe long-term solutions. So I was just wondering whether, especially in this current climate, there might be a need to, formulate it differently, maybe, move to more radical politics. So we, for example, frame it around notions of flight help, the Underground Railroad in the European context, and so forth. So I was just wondering whether you had any opinions on
that. You're right, I'm not a spokesperson for them. Their explicit mission, I understand your point, and I agree with a lot of it, but their explicit mission is real simple. It's just to save lives through the distribution of water. There are the kind of organizations that you're talking about that have emerged actually in Tucson, a group called, I think it's called People Helping People. I believe that's the name of the organization, out of Arivaca, Arizona, has adopted some of the strategies that you were talking about. I hesitate to speak for Humane Borders any more than what I already am, but I think it's safe to say that their mission is singularly focused, and it's a hard enough mission as it is to maintain the water and to maintain the right and ability to actually go out into the desert. And as I said before, there's a real concern that this may become criminalized. And what happens then, we'll see. Thank you.
Another question over here on this side.
Okay. I have a pair of questions. The first is from Maria. I'm kind of curious what you think the policy implications, you mentioned that briefly at the end, but what you think some of the policy implications might be of people being sad and shocked about learning about this news, because it seems to me that the policy fallout from people being exposed to that information is not necessarily obvious. It might work in various different directions. And then the question I had for Professor Rocha is what, and maybe it's beyond the scope of this particular investigation, but what the role of state organizations like Texas DPS and other law enforcement agencies at the local level, and what, if there's variation in those in the period you're looking at, and how that affects deportation policy.
Well, in terms of policy, as I mentioned, it would have to be a very long-term sustained effort to bring attention to the issue of border deaths. But the fact that what is a dehumanized group can be humanized by putting numbers and faces and just awareness to the actual conditions they're suffering through could potentially lead to changing attitudes, but again, it would have to be a long-term sustained effort to bring attention to it. So it would be difficult to see any immediate and concrete policy implications, but again, it would have to be a long-term effort to humanize a dehumanized group.
So yeah, you're correct, right? There's a lot of variation in terms of how much local law enforcement agencies and how much other state organizations are willing to cooperate with federal officials, right? And so before secure communities especially, right, when you have the 287G program, you have some jurisdictions entering into what are called memorandums of agreement, right? Those are all some places deciding they're going to work with the federal government, some places deciding they're not going to work with the federal government. And so one of the innovations of secure communities was that it basically started to force everybody to do it. And even people that sort of didn't really want to. And by 2013, by 2011, really everyone's on board with secure communities. By 2013, it's like mandatory that every jurisdiction has to be on board with secure communities. And so that really sort of helps to work against the idea that some places are just going to be more in it and some places are going to be less in it. Now, that started to get pulled back again in the latter half of the Obama administration. So the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security was sued, and because the way secure communities works, right, is that once ICE identifies somebody who might be in the country without documentation, they send something called a detainer request to the let's say the county jail, and that's asking the county jail officials to hold the person 48 hours past what they would normally hold them in order to give ICE officials a chance to head on over and pick up the person. And they got sued because they're basically forcing local law enforcement to enforce immigration law by holding the person in custody for 48 hours. And the local jurisdictions won. And it became clear that the federal government can request that that happen, but they cannot mandate that it happen. And once that was clear, then a whole bunch of places started opting out again, right? And so California, Colorado, Johnson County, Iowa, right, my home county, is just sort of opts out. Now, what's happening is that as of last week, President Trump has made it clear that he will try to deny federal grants to jurisdictions to continue to do that. He has also stated that he is going to track all declined detainer requests and publish logs, right? And so there's going to be an attempt. So we've had this part of that willingness to cooperate being very important, it becoming less important as the program gets federalized and sort of mandated, and then it becoming more important again. And now we're going to try and go back, right? We're going to try and sort of browbeat all of these jurisdictions, and how successful it'll be, I don't know. I mean, denying federal funding is a pretty big threat, right? So perhaps very successful, yeah.
We have a question right here.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Samantha. I'm an undergraduate student. I have a question regarding what they're calling the Blue Lives Matter law in Louisiana. I haven't done any real investigation on it, whether or not there are other states working on passing similar laws, what that will mean just as far as someone attempting to evade arrest, for example, if that will apply as a hate crime, what that's going to mean for immigrant law enforcement issues. And I'm directing this to Professor Rocha first, and then please everyone weigh in. I'm interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure particularly about sort of how we might see this sort of Blue Lives Matter. But there's a lot of different laws that are getting proposed, and I think they're all going to have sort of the really massive effects. So that one might change sort of the relationship, that the hesitancy to sort of evade or work against enforcement officials. But again, with the border, this is where we get into the border enforcement and interior enforcement being really, really, really different. Because interior enforcement, there's not really as much invasion, right? A lot of times, again, if it's secure communities, they're already in custody. They're just in custody, and they're local law enforcement, and they're just getting plucked out by the federal government, right? Or prior to secure communities, there's a large number of raids. The tendency to where ICE would just come in and do a work site raid and just apprehend 300 people at one point in time, right? So not really the opportunity to sort of evade. I actually have a suspicion that what we're going to see is an increase in the number of raids over the next couple of years. ICE really abandoned the raid policy because it's really kind of ineffective. It takes a lot of resources. You only get a couple people at a time for a lot of planning, and so secure communities was just like a way more efficient method. But raids are really good TV and really good news, and I think we have a president who cares a lot about headlines and good shots, and so I think we'll see a return, even if it's a little bit less efficient. But other things that are being proposed, you know, one of the things that bothers me the most is part of the Anti-Illegal Immigration Act, which includes building the wall, yada yada, which gets sort of the most attention and is obviously a sort of major issue. But one of the things it's doing is it's going to make a 2-year mandatory minimum federal prison sentence for all people who are in violation of prior removal orders. That means you've come to the country, you've been deported, you returned, you came back. Now you've come back a second time, right? That person is now subject to a 2-year mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. Number of people in 2014 who that would have brought in, 190,000. Total number of people in federal prison in 2014, like 215,000. So it's a doubling, and but it's a 2-year prison sentence, so it's, you know, it's that number times 2, so it's not even a doubling, it's more than a doubling of the size of the federal prison population, which, you know, sounds kind of difficult to conceive how that's possibly going to happen, but that's what's proposed right now.
We have a question right here in the middle.
I guess I have 3 kind of questions and comments. One would be what you just mentioned, that the size of the federal prison, how it could possibly become larger. There is those private prison systems that were very briefly outlawed. I'm not quite sure their status now, like the Correction Corporation of America, something of that sort. So the privately run prisons and their funding. So that's my question for you. The other question for Professor Irwin, what I see is a dichotomy between a liberal political strategy of let's just focus on the narratives that are acceptable, and maybe a human rights strategy of it's all of us or none of us, meaning if someone is accused of being a criminal and then is killed somewhere along the line, maybe their story doesn't matter or has suffered certain things somewhere along the line because they were a criminal. So what is your personal perspective on that? And the third question, one of my daughters participated in the No More Deaths group, and she went as a family nurse practitioner. Even though I'm, I guess, partially Latina, my daughter looks completely Latina. And some of the situations that she faced, and I'm wondering about you. One is that she did actually treat wounds. There were a lot of foot wounds, and she faced the situation where she saw, you know, someone who potentially life-threatening medical issue, and she asked, you know, they ask, do you want us to call the Border Patrol? And the response has been no. And so, you know, from a very human perspective, you've got to let that person go because they have made their decision. They do not want the Border Patrol contacted. You know, have you run into things like that? And also, have you had Latina or Latino people with you at the time? Because what she experienced also was the recognition, oh, I'm with all these other white, wonderful people who have come here to help, but she runs as a dual citizen, the extra layer of actually looking Latina in that whole situation. So 3 questions.
I think the role of the private prison industry cannot be overemphasized in this process. And sort of a brief note of clarification, you mentioned a brief outlawing of private prisons. The Department of Justice said at the end of the Obama administration they were no longer going to use private prisons. Of course, anyone who's being held for an immigration violation is not being held by the Department of Justice, they're being held by the Department of Homeland Security. And so about 20% of people in federal custody held in private prisons are in DOJ custody. The other 80% were under DHS. And so that move by DOJ, you know, you can herald it, but it was really, really not as consequential. DHS is the organization that really uses private prisons, and they never made any such promise. I'll link this back to the question about state and federal partnerships. If you look at the early states that got involved in 287G or SB 1070 copycat types of legislation. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that those pushes came at the behest of the private prison industry, asking local law enforcement to become more active in the enforcement of immigration law, which is going to net more people in custody, which is going to net more detentions, which is going to net them more business, right? And so in some ways, this is a really simple story. It's anecdotal. We don't really have it. We don't have that relationship really systematized. I'm actually trying to talk to Brad right now and see if we can work on a paper sort of doing that. But I do not think you can overemphasize the role of the sort of private prison industry in this process.
In response to your question to me, thank you very much for that question, and it allows me to, I think, clarify a little bit what I wanted to say. I think it relates a lot to Maurice's first question about what Humane Borders is doing, what its politics is. And so I think that we need to always have a practical politics in whatever group we're working with or whatever individual acts we're realizing in our day-to-day lives. And so we need to do what's feasible. We need to do what works, what can be accepted. And so if Humane Borders needs to work with the National Park Service, there are probably limits on the way that they need to represent themselves and maybe can't represent themselves the way that Watch the Med can. But while we do that, we need to, and as we are able to achieve things in those political spaces, we need not to be complacent. We need to be thinking about what our real ethical engagement with the issues are, and to be kind of questioning with a lot of nuance, which is why I think it's important to look at individual cases to see what Maria was suggesting, to see individual cases, humanize issues, so that we're able to really think beyond the practical categories, which often set limits that are really not ethical ones that we couldn't really be at ease with if we thought about it carefully. And so we have to have, on the one hand, a kind of a real politic that allows us to achieve what we think we can achieve, but also maybe sometimes be thinking in terms of infrapolitics, a kind of a concealed politics that sometimes allows us to do something else that is more in kind of agreement with our own personal ethics.
And I think I'll have the last word because we got to end the panel. But thank you for that question. In terms of having like a Latino or Latino out on a run, if I go, they do. My dad's Mexican. My last name is utterly made up. He changed his name because he got tired of being discriminated against. His last name was Jaime. I look more like my mom, though. But in terms of your question, it's a really good question. The way Humane Borders works is there's only 2 people that go out in any run. There's one trained volunteer that has authorization to drive the truck. Some of the trained drivers are Hispanic, some aren't. Anyone can volunteer to do that, but there's only 2 that go out. The practical reality is that every run I've ever gone on, almost every run I've ever gone on, you don't encounter migrants. It's very rare to actually encounter a migrant because we go out in the daytime, and most of the migrant traffic is like very, very early in the morning or at night, and they're either concealed or you just don't encounter them. The encounters that I'm aware of, a lot of times the migrants actually want to turn themselves in because they volunteer to be picked up because they've just been chased. They've the whole night long. They're terrified. They're in tattered clothes. They're injured, and they're just tired of it. And I mean I guess I would say that's my experience with it. Yeah. So I guess that's my answer. So.
Okay, we want to say thank you to our panelists, the first panel of the day. Thank you to the audience for excellent questions. There's going to be about a 10-minute break, and then the next panel will begin.